Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Rocco, again, bringing you guys another album review. And today we're going to be talking about David Bowie's 1970 masterpiece, or, what I consider to be a masterpiece, The Man Who Sold the World. This album here has long been one of my all-time favorite Bowie albums. That might be a bit controversial. A lot of people seem to consider this a tier 2 Bowie album, and I can see where people are coming from. I do have criticisms of the album, but it just really speaks to me, as a hard rock fan and as a fan of some more out there, weird, strange music. This album here really has the best of both worlds and has some of the strangest David Bowie material. Definitely not a very easy album to get into, at least in my opinion, but with those hard rockin' riffs and that bluesy edge, it just speaks to me, guys, and it's an awesome album. And, I was thinking today, what album to review, and I realized I haven't touched on David Bowie yet on my channel, and I'm a huge David Bowie fan. I'm singling out this album as the first, because it's the first of the major David Bowie albums that I actually love, and it's not my favorite. I wouldn't put this at number 1 or 2 or 3, but yeah, I realized I haven't done any David Bowie reviews, and I fucking love the guy. He's one of my all-time favorite solo artists. Right up there, and I have no shame saying this, with Elton John, Billy Joel, Neil Young, and who am I forgetting here? Bob Dylan as well. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, and I realized that this channel is definitely lacking on the solo artist. Peter Gabriel is another one that popped into mind. On the solo artist material, I usually focus on bands and progressive rock and jazz fusion and metal and everything. But things are going to start changing, because I think that some of these solo artists that really got their start in the late 60s, early 70s, just put forth some of the most creative material of all time. And there's definitely going to be more of those reviews coming your way, so stay tuned. David Bowie just really embodies that. This guy here, just one of my all-time favorite musicians. His creativity knows no bounds. We all know him as this wonderful chameleon who kind of shapeshifted and did all kinds of different things, really mastering almost every genre of music. He even dabbled in some electronica later on in the 90s. Not that I haven't really heard much of his late 90s stuff, or any of it, to be honest, but I know he dabbled in that, and I know he got some good results. But always throughout his career, it had that David Bowie essence, and there's just something about him that's just so mystical, so magical, and just larger than life. And he was just such a wonderful man. Every interview I've seen of him, he just seems so down to earth, respectful, and you wouldn't think so, because he's so out there, he's so, flashy and larger than life when it comes to his music, his art, just the way he expresses himself visually. But deep down inside, he just seemed like such a great guy, and he was married for 30 years or something, and I was obsessed with David Bowie back in 2017 when I first got into him, and that's the thing I kind of regret. I really started getting into David Bowie after he passed away. Which was, tragic, obviously. Right when he died, I remember hearing a few songs off Ziggy Stardust for the first time, other than the big hits that they would play on the radio. Because, of course, I knew, Suffragette City, the title track, things like Life on Mars, all the hits, which I absolutely loved. But for one reason or another, I never really delved into his discography. But then starting that year forward, me and my friend, we just deeply dove into David Bowie's discography, and he went a little bit further than me. He really listened to all the albums. I'm kind of lacking on his mid 80s to early 2000s material. Still got to get on that, but I've heard everything else. And my friend was such a huge David Bowie fan at that time that he actually ranked every single song. I don't know how he did it. The man must have fucking 300 songs at this point, but yeah, just a wonderful artist, someone who really inspired me at that time. And since then, since that huge David Bowie binge in 2017, 2018, I've been on and off, but every time I come back to David Bowie, it's always a wonderful experience. And this is one of the albums that I come back to a lot, because it just speaks to me. It's just so heavy, probably his heaviest album. And as I mentioned, that's probably what really, kept me going with this album, kept me coming back. But I still come back to a lot of his other albums as well. So definitely more David Bowie coming your way. So The Man Who Sold the World. When I first heard this album, I think it was one of the earlier ones that I'd heard. I don't think I'd heard the Berlin trilogy yet. I'd heard Hunky Dory, Ziggy Stardust, obviously. I think Diamond Dogs, Aladdin, saying, those glam period David Bowie albums. Then I heard this, and my mind was absolutely blown. I'm like, holy fuck, this is one of the heaviest albums of the early 70s, and I still do think that. This thing is just, right up there with, Sabbath and fucking Zeppelin and things like that. but with a really dark, sinister, and haunting edge that a lot of those other bands didn't have, other than Sabbath, of course. But I'm talking bands like Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, those early 70s hard rock bands. Didn't have the insane kind of sinister edge that this album had, and that really appealed to me at the time. It instantly became one of my favorite Bowie albums, and since then it's always had a soft spot in my heart. It's in the top tier Bowie albums in my opinion. So I'm gonna have a good time reviewing it for you guys today, and definitely stay tuned for more Bowie reviews coming your way, guys. And this album here has a lot of what I consider to be underappreciated or underrated Bowie songs, like all the Madmen, Width of a Circle, Savior Machine. Like these songs are all just classics for me, and I don't know, they just never get mentioned among the David Bowie tracks. So I think that a lot of people just haven't really delved into this album or discovered it. If it's just me and my weird taste in music, let me know down below. Like maybe this album isn't as great as I think it is, or at least in my opinion it is. But anyway, I love it. And of course we got the title track, which was covered by Nirvana. And funny thing is, I always knew the Nirvana one as a kid because that's the one they would play on my local radio station. And then I heard the original by Bowie, and it was just so much better. And I haven't looked back since. I don't think I've heard the Nirvana version since because I haven't been listening to my local radio station lately. But it just blew me away. So without further ado, guys, let's talk a little bit about the making behind the album, the history behind it, which I find very interesting. So let's get into that. Alright guys, decided to take it into the backyard because it's such a nice day outside today. At least we'll chill out here for a bit. But yeah, let's talk about the history behind The Man Who Sold the World. This album here, guys, I have a feeling that this album kind of slips under the radar for a few reasons. And the main one was, first of all, it wasn't very commercially successful at the time. And second of all, I've seen so many reviews of David Bowie's work saying that Hunky Dory was really the start of his classic period. So a lot of people, a lot of new fans are going to be starting off with Hunky Dory or maybe his more accessible 2000 stuff or 90s stuff or whatever, and kind of not really looking back to Bowie's first three albums. Now, I will give you that. The first David Bowie album isn't very good. Again, I don't even think David Bowie considers it to be his true debut. The second one, Space Oddity, or simply titled David Bowie, depending on which version you have, is pretty decent. It's very folky and very singer-songwriter style. But this one here was a huge step forward, I think, both in terms of creativity and intensity. I mean, this album here is just intense, and it has that eccentricity that was kind of missing on the earlier Bowie albums. Okay, I guess the debut is very eccentric, but it isn't very good. So it's the first of the good eccentric Bowie albums, if you want to put it that way. And and I really think that a lot of the newer fans are starting off with Hunky Dory and working their way forward and kind of missing this album. So I think it's kind of slipped under the radar for years. And again, the hard rock sound of it might turn a few people off. Again, David Bowie wasn't really known for his hard rock sound, so that could alienate a few fans. But I think more people definitely got to give this album a try. It's a great album. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the history. So at this point, David Bowie wasn't very commercially successful. He'd been in a few bands in the early 60s, and in 1967 he actually got a record deal with Decca Records, releasing his debut album just simply titled David Bowie, and it just failed to chart on all levels. It was just this weird combination of psychedelia and avant-garde pop music and dance hall music and things like that. Just, not what David Bowie would end up being known for. And he pretty much gave up on music at that point. From 67 to late 69, he really didn't do anything. He actually went into different artistic endeavors like miming and cinema and things like that, and kind of just gave up a bit on music. But then 1969 came around, and he was getting back into it, recorded the hit song Space Oddity, and this was about, I think, a week before the Apollo 11 launch, and it was just the right song at the right time. And it did fantastic on the charts. I believe it was a top 5 single in the UK. It's a classic song. It featured Rick Wakeman on keyboards. And it finally seemed like David Bowie was catching his big break. Now, sadly, the album of the same name, or David Bowie, that was released shortly after that, failed to chart as well. It didn't do well. And that's the thing. You had that one classic track really holding that album together. And again, a lot of the other songs on that album are very good. There's nothing wrong with them whatsoever. But nothing as phenomenal as that track. So at that time, Bowie was considered one of these one-hit wonders where he had this amazing single, but the album just didn't really get any attention. So it was just a depressing time. Bowie thought, that single had poised him for success and that he would go on to have a huge career, but it just wasn't happening. And at that time, he married his first wife, Angela Bowie, and he had other distractions coming into place. So, it wasn't really a very strong time for David Bowie, creatively or commercially, for that matter. And David Bowie knew that if he was going to be able to have a musical career, something to support himself and his new family, he really had to do something differently. And he knew that, he needed a tight band behind him. He couldn't really go forward with this whole singer-songwriter thing, which was kind of dying out in the early 70s. Really, it was the era of the band at that point. And again, there were many exceptions, but for the most part, band music or group, composed music was really the norm at that point. So he set out to find a nice band to back him up. The first guy he recruited was Tony Visconti, who had been his producer. He's also a bass player, so he recruited him as the bassist. Also got Mick Ronson, who played a huge role in David Bowie's career going forward. Fantastic guitar player, and really a main contributor to this album. Picked him up from, I can't remember what band he was in, but he was in a few unsuccessful bands before. And they got him on guitar. And a dude named John Cambridge on drums. So their initial concept was to be a fully formed, kind of cohesive, collaborative band. With David Bowie, he always knew he was going to be the leader of the band, but they weren't going to be marketing themselves as David Bowie. They were going to be marketing themselves as a band. And they chose the name The Hype, I believe. And they had this gimmick where they would dress up as superheroes and go on stage. And I think they only played one show, and it was disastrous. It didn't really go well. So David Bowie, he went back to the old idea of, calling the band the David Bowie Group, or David Bowie and his backing band. Later, they would be known as the Spiders from Mars. But right now, they didn't really have a name. And he ditched the gimmick because it was kind of stupid. And I guess that came from Bowie's past in miming and cinema and things like that, and drama. He really wanted to show his dramatic side, but that whole superhero thing did not go down well. So they went into the studio to record his next album, the follow-up to David Bowie / Space Oddity. And things weren't going well. He kept getting into fights with the drummer, John Cambridge, and he ended up firing him. He thought he was fucking... David Bowie's exact words were, "You're fucking up my album." So he let John Cambridge go, and he replaced him with a dude named Mick Woodmansey. And I got to check my notes because, I forget names all the time. And so they went into the studio and recorded this album here, The Man Who Sold the World. Now, it's kind of controversial because there's two kind of sides of the story of how this album came into being. Now, according to Tony Visconti, the making of this album was actually very stressful, and he was really upset with David Bowie after this album, to the point where he kind of left the band after the tour. And thank God they would later reconcile. He would later go on to be David Bowie's longtime collaborator, longtime producer. But he didn't really enjoy the making of this album. And basically, his side of the story is that, David Bowie just recently married Angie Bowie, and they were basically writing and rehearsing this stuff in Bowie's house, or whatever, his flat in London or whatever. I don't fucking know where it was. But anyway, they were rehearsing there, and all the guy was doing was just chilling out on the sofa with his wife, while the band was just, jamming and coming up with all these ideas. And according to Visconti, Bowie, after the songs were fully composed by the band, Bowie would get off his ass, quickly write some lyrics, then go back to that sofa and start, messing around with his wife. So really, according to Visconti, and, for him to say this years later, there must be some truth behind it. But because he did reconcile with Bowie, and they were longtime collaborators, but he still maintained the fact that Bowie didn't really contribute much compositionally to the album, and a few of the other band members agreed. So that's one side of the story. But David Bowie as well mentions that it's not true, and he denies it, and he says that not only did he contribute a lot to the writing sessions for this album, but a lot of the songs, or actually Width of a Circle and the Supermen, were actually preconceived and pre-written before he even had the band together. So it's really these two competing sides of the story, and I guess we'll never really know what's true about it. And, you can't really use the excuse that, oh, this album sounds like no other Bowie album, so therefore the band must have written it, because all the Bowie albums sound different. Of course, he had his glam period in the 70s where, okay, there was a lot of overlap, but for the most part, all of his albums were unique and sound completely different. I mean, if you listen to this album, or even Ziggy Stardust, then you put on like Young Americans or Lodger or something like that, all three of those albums sound like completely different artists. So you can't use that excuse. So really, at the end of the day, we don't really know what what the truth is, but both sides must have some truth to it, because I can't imagine David Bowie having no hand in the writing. A lot of this music is quintessential Bowie, in terms of the insanity and the madness, and not just the lyrics, musically as well. It has Bowie written all over it. So I believe Bowie and Tony Visconti. Maybe he was neglecting the band a bit, but I don't think to the same extent that Visconti was making it out to be. So anyway, after the making of this album, there was some controversy with the album cover. Originally, David Bowie had this plan where he was going to have this painting on the album cover with a man standing outside of a mental institution with a gun and, all this weird stuff, like his head kind of disintegrating and this weird bubble. He was going to say something controversial in this thought bubble, but the record label scrapped it or something. That was the original cover. And then Bowie, he had a change of thought, and he decided to put a more androgynous cover. So he decided to get a photographer to come to his apartment and film him wearing a full-on dress, reclining on a sofa, very androgynous and controversial for the time. Again, this was the early 70s. And that was going to be the original cover. Now, needless to say, it ended up being the cover in the UK, but the US rejected it, those backwards fucks. And I guess they replaced it with the second best option, which was the original artwork that Bowie had planned for it. But yeah, I really like the album cover. This, again, it's just so weird and out there. It doesn't really fit the music, but I just love the look of it. I love the photo. And it's just a statement that Bowie was making, that he was different from the rest, and he had his eccentricities. So after that, Bowie really ran with this image. When they had interviews, he would dress up. He would go on in that full-on 18th century or 19th century dress, whatever the fuck it was. And he would flaunt himself. And at this point, the album wasn't even released. And people would be seeing him doing these interviews with these dresses and everything. And again, he wasn't big at the time. He wasn't famous. So people were thinking, like, who the fuck's this dude, It must have been a sight to behold. But anyway, they ended up going on tour in, I believe, January and February of 71. Went to the States, again, dressed in that full regalia. And a lot of the Americans didn't really like it, to say the least. One dude even pulled a gun on him at one point. Told him to kiss his ass, according to Wikipedia. I don't know. I read a David Bowie biography a few years ago. I can't remember if that was in there as well, so I can't confirm. But according to Wikipedia, that actually happened. He didn't get hurt or anything, but it's just a funny incident that happened. And then during this tour, David Bowie was very influenced by stars like Iggy Pop and Lou Reed, and they would later go on to become collaborators of his on later albums. So that tour was actually pretty good. But sadly, the album just didn't chart as well, and it was just another flop for David Bowie. And again, I think that's really why this album kind of slips under the radar. And it's strange because, it was bigger in the States than the UK. The States were big on the hard rock at the time, so they must have gotten it. But it still failed to chart, which is kind of depressing. There were no really hit singles off the album. And David Bowie's kind of back to the drawing board after this. So yeah, commercially not successful, but artistically, I think it's a big achievement for Bowie. And this is what I consider the true start of his classic period, where in the 70s he just reigned supreme as probably the greatest solo artist of all time. Or he always had a great backup band, but really he was the mastermind behind it all. And the sad thing is, after the tour, the band kind of broke up, and there was a lot of bad blood with the band, and Tony Visconti left, saying that Bowie, wasn't into it. He didn't really contribute much to the writing. And there were disputes with, how they were going to be financially compensated at the time. So the band kind of dissolved, and Bowie was back to the drawing board. Now, thankfully, when I review Hunky Dory, I'll get more in detail with this part. But eventually, the band did get back together, and Bowie convinced them, after like 9 long months, to really come back, and things were going to be different this time. And they went on to make Hunky Dory, Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, all these classic early albums. So yeah, thank God David Bowie persisted, because I can't imagine a world without those albums. And, if you think about it, Bowie was trying so hard since the mid-'60s. And we're in, 1971 now, and he still hadn't really had any success other than, Space Oddity. So it really says something about a person when they're trying to do something for about 6-7 years and not really getting anywhere, and just they keep persisting, and with uncompromising artistic vision. I mean, when he went to Hunky Dory, that album there wasn't any more commercial than this one. I mean, that album there is also pretty crazy. Well, maybe it was a little more commercial, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. He never really sacrificed his artistic ambitions. And he really got over the stumbling block of the early part of his career and ended up becoming a sensation. And really, like his most successful album coming out in 1983 really does say something about this guy, just persisting and overcoming all these obstacles. So I love the history behind this album. It's kind of inspirational, kind of controversial, but makes for an interesting read. So without further ado, let's get into the review of this album. All right, guys, so let's talk about this album a little bit more under the microscope here with the overall review. I already mentioned multiple times that The Man Who Sold the World is by far the heaviest Bowie album. But you know what? There were a lot of heavy albums out in the 70s, and especially the year 1970 when all those pioneering bands really started making waves in the heavy genre of music. So what really sets this album aside? Well, there are multiple things. And first, what I really want to get across is that Mick Ronson's contribution to this album on guitar is freaking fantastic. And again, Mick Ronson would stay in the band for quite some time. Eventually, when the band became the Spiders of Mars, he would contribute a little bit more to the whole arranging process of Bowie's work. But on this album, holy shit, guys, he must have definitely been inspired by Zeppelin, Sabbath, Deep Purple, because his riffs on this album are absolutely chugging, distorted proto-metal awesomeness. I mean, there are some really, really heavy riffs on this album. And it's interesting because, again, David Bowie would do nothing like this before. It's just heavy, rocking, headbanging. There's some great guitar solos, bluesy licks all over the place. He just gives a fantastic performance, adding a totally different color in David Bowie's palette. And this album here is just really going to please a lot of the hard rock fans. But it isn't an easy listen, and that's really what I want to get across with this album. This isn't like, a Deep Purple album. You could just put it on and just rock out and have a good time. This is a very disturbing album, a very sinister, atmospheric, and very unsettling album. The imagery that this album evokes is absolutely crazy, and I literally mean insane, because the lyrical content of this album and David Bowie's delivery of that lyric with his vocal inflections is just very disturbing. And that was the whole idea. He was really trying to get across the whole concept of madness and other unsettling things like the Vietnam War and all this occult stuff he was dealing with at the time, especially on the track Width of a Circle. So this is a very dark and sinister album. And again, the subject matter, a lot of songs about madness, which really was a running theme with David Bowie's work, because madness really ran in his family. His aunt apparently suffered from mental illness her whole life, and his older brother, tragic story, he ended up killing himself, I think laying himself down on the train tracks, and he'd been in mental asylums his whole life, and not David Bowie, David Bowie's brother. And that really left a big imprint on him and really influenced him to write these songs dealing with mental illness at a time where not many people were dealing with that at the time. And again, this album here deals with it on the song All the Madmen, which I consider to be one of the greatest David Bowie songs. And if I had to pick like his most underappreciated song, that would probably be the one. It's one of my all-time favorites. And but my favorite song dealing with this is actually on the next album, Hunky Dory, the Bowie Brothers, which is like a top 10 at least David Bowie song for me. But this album has it as well. And at this point in time, David Bowie's voice was just very eccentric, very shrill, high-pitched, and there's a lot of effects going on in his voice on this album as well that give it that unsettling vibe, and just the inflections that he puts on his vocals, the eccentricity and the sharpness, the bilious nature of the delivery of his vocals on this album is just really inaccessible. And again, you have those hard rock riffs that you're going to think, oh, what's so inaccessible about hard rock riffs? But with the imagery of the lyrics and David Bowie's, again, bilious delivery of the lyrics, it makes for an unsettling listen. And, I mentioned that I go back to this album a lot, and it's true, but you really got to be in the mood for it. You can't just sit down and, rock out and have a good time. There are a few songs where you can, but for the most part, this album is really out there. So that's really what sets it apart from the other albums. It's just this crazy mess. But the music itself, let's say you stripped off David Bowie's vocals and lyrics, you would just have a very solid early 70s hard rock album. But add in the magic of Bowie, and it just takes on a totally different character. And that's what I love about it. So great album there. And the songs themselves are just fantastic. The songwriting is memorable. And, I'm going to criticize it. It's not a perfect album. There is one song in particular that I'm not a huge fan of. But yeah, overall, it's pretty flawless, actually. Well, I just said I'm going to criticize it, so how could it be flawless? But taken as a whole, when I look at this album, I have nothing but fond memories of it. And when you're in the mood for it, when you're in the mood for a dark, depressing album, which is ironic because today was so hot and sunny outside, it really hits the spot. So excellent album, and again the bluesy influence as well is right there, with especially with Mick Ronson's guitar playing. Also some pretty nice keyboard playing and some nice flute sounding keyboard playing by David Bowie and Tony Visconti, as well as a little bit of sax here and there. Very minimal compared to later David Bowie work, but if you guys didn't know, David Bowie was a pretty proficient saxophone player, and but on this album he's kind of keeping that to a minimum. So yeah, a very ominous and haunting album. That's probably the best way I would describe it, with a heavy edge to it. So definitely not an easy album to get into. I really think that, the albums after this were much more accessible. And I don't think David Bowie would really get into, unaccessible territory again until the Low album, or maybe even Station to Station, or he started being a little bit more experimental at those points. But again, at that time, his voice had developed, and no longer did we have this shrill, kind of creepy performance he gives on this album. He had developed into one of the greatest singers of the baritone range, with that kind of crooning voice, which is just awesome, soulful, and fantastic. Really what I consider the classic David Bowie voice. Earlier on, he really hadn't found his voice yet. So even though those albums might be a little bit more inaccessible, at least you had the accessible David Bowie vocals at this point. This album here is just nothing like that. And again, I just want to end the review by saying, holy shit, this must have been a shock for like his small fan base at the time that had been used to his like folky kind of singer-songwriting shit that was going on the previous album. This one is just a complete 180. Sure, there are some folky moments, and let me just adjust the camera a bit. Sure, there are some folky moments, and you do get some acoustic guitar. There is kind of a slower paced kind of track on the album that doesn't really feature electric instruments, but almost nothing compared to the last one that came before it. And it doesn't even have it doesn't have any really majestic moments, kind of like the title track, Space Oddity, which had that amazing Rick Wakeman mellotron playing. This one here is just sharp, acidic, in your face, and just unsettling through and through. So a very, very different album. And again, the next one, Hunky Dory, it would have some weird moments here and there, but for the most part, I'd say that album isn't too hard to get into, at least. So this is kind of like a standalone thing. So yeah, awesome album, guys. Now let's take a look at this album track by track, and then we'll wrap things up. So kickstarting the album, guys, we get the longest track, and what I believe a lot of people would consider the best song on the album. I definitely hear this song among, as well as the title track, being really mentioned the most out of all the tracks on this album, and it really deserves it. The first track here, Width of a Circle, is an absolute David Bowie classic, and probably the most accessible song on the whole album, along with the title track, so that might be why this one here often gets singled out. But it's a really good song, a really rocking tune, and one that's really split up into two distinct parts, both of them very heavy, very rocking, and excellent. And I believe the subject matter of the song is really strange as well. It has a lot of these like occult references, which apparently David Bowie was really into at the time. And apparently it describes a sexual encounter with a demon or a god or something like that, which is really cool. And then later on in the song, it gets really sexual in the second half of the track. But yeah, the whole song is just great. Mick Ronson's on fire. Tony Visconti's bass just really jumps out on this song, and it's really like one of the major highlights of the track. I mean, his bass is absolutely like chugging at points. And David Bowie does a fantastic job as always. What I love about this track, fucking Mick Ronson, guys, his riffs on the song are so memorable, especially the opening kind of sludgy, almost doomy riff that opens up the track. Absolutely excellent, absolutely iconic, and just one of those extremely memorable riffs in hard rock that you just can't forget. And I love how there's acoustic guitar going in the background as well, giving the heaviness of the main riff that counterbalance. Really awesome stuff. And then before you know it, it dives into this more up-tempo rocking section with another riff, a more chugging one, less sludgy, with the whereas the opening riff was more so two fantastic riffs, and Bowie comes in and he does those like little vocal inflections here and there that give like the song this little touch of eccentricity. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward, pretty rocking, and very easy to get into. But then at the 2 minute mark, we get an awesome Mick Ronson guitar solo. Starts off pretty conventional, but then it gets a little bit more avant-garde and atonal at the end there before going back into the main, the chugging riff of the track. So really cool. Then before you know it, the main riff comes back in, the original riff that opened it up. And it's a great reprise because you didn't forget about it, but it hasn't really appeared for a while, so that was a nice reprise of the earlier part of the song. Before getting into this kind of dreamy acoustic section, and this soaring melodic riff comes out on the guitar, and it's awesome. It's kind of like almost a variation of the opening riff, but much more melodic and less doomy, less heavy. It's just a beautiful section of the song amidst all the craziness and heaviness. And then we get these awesome chanting vocals, these awesome harmonies coming in with the just a very mystical part of the track, which I absolutely love. Then before we know it, we get into the second half of the song, the more up-tempo, the more chugging, the more rocking section of the track. And it's very bluesy as well. In this part here, David Bowie sounds very up-tempo and very playful and rocking. And this section here really describes, the details of the sexual encounter, which are, they're not vulgar or anything, but yeah, you can get a sense of this weird imagery going on there. And there's another bluesy guitar solo coming in later in the track, and it reprises that vocal chant section later on too. It's just a wonderful song, guys. One of the best songs on the album, definitely. And anyone can get into this one. So I would give The Width of a Circle easily a 9 to a 9.5 out of 10. It's kind of like the epic of the album, so you can't go wrong. So track number 2, guys, All the Madmen. I fucking love this song, guys. For me, this is a David Bowie classic, one of my all-time favorite David Bowie songs. It's just such a sinister, haunting, and insane song. You gotta love it. And it really comes from deep down inside, because again, David Bowie really dealt with a lot of mental illness in his family, and even he was always worried that he himself would succumb to it at one point in his life. Thank God he never really did, unless you count drug addiction as mental illness, which it definitely is, but you know what I mean. But yeah, this song here really describes just the torment that people go through. They used to put people in mental asylums at the drop of a hat back in the day. And David Bowie's brother, unfortunately, was one of those people that was committed multiple times. And, the whole theme of the track just really delves into, do these people really belong here? And, it's just an incredible song. I don't know how to describe it. Fantastic lyrics, some of the best David Bowie lyrics, and some really disturbing imagery laid down in these lyrics, talking about things like self-harm and, crazy stuff like that. Just a very powerful song, and very haunting, very sinister. Also a very progressive song. This one goes through a lot of changes, and I love how the song just gradually has this build to it. It gets really climactic at points, and it's just excellent. I'll walk you guys through some of the highlights. So kicking things off with this ominous acoustic guitar riff, and then David Bowie comes in, and he sounds very, very, very subdued and ominous, and it's just sends shivers up and down your spine. And then there's like little flourishes of flute, or I think it's vibraphone or something, some kind of weird instrument that gives it this kind of playful nursery rhyme kind of feel, adding to that little touch of madness that represents really the whole theme of the track there. But then before you know it, we get the pounding drums kicking in, and it comes into that classic Man Who Sold the World sound with the chugging Mick Ronson riffs. And I love this part here. David Bowie gets more and more sinister, and it's just heavy as fuck, and it has this awesome build to it before getting into the chorus, which is awesome as well. Then right after the chorus, we get this kind of climactic guitar line or guitar riff that comes in that really resolves the tension that was built up by that, that crazy build up there. And it's just awesome. Then there's a big switch up at around the 2-minute 30-second mark, where it gets into this weird spoken word section with childlike vocals in the background, which, again, is just a very strange, very haunting and weird section of the track, before coming back with that main riff. And this time, that flute or vibraphone or whatever that weird high-pitched instrument is, it's right up there in the mix with the guitar, really uniting those two kind of themes of the track, the madness and the heavy rock riffs. And it just picks up the pace and starts chugging and gets into this really frantic section with the drumming there. I love that. The ending is also a highlight. We get that melodic riff again, the one that I said earlier that relieved the tension, with these great harmonies in the background and this catchy kind of change kind of vocal melody. Really, really cool. So many changes going on in this song. It's haunting, it's sinister, very ominous, and crazy as well. A little bit hard to get into, especially with that middle spoken word section there. Just not an easy listen, but a fantastic song at that. And one of my favorite Bowie songs, easily a 9.5 out of 10. Okay, guys, so then we make our way to track number 3, which is called Black Country Rock. And earlier on in the video, I said that the opening song, Width of a Circle, and the title track are the most accessible songs on the album. Well, this song may have slipped my mind because Black Country Rock is just this nice, up-tempo, chugging, heavy rocker that doesn't really take much to get into. It's just a really short and sweet 3.5-minute chugging, heavy tune. And again, Mick Ronson here really takes center stage with his absolutely chugging riff and blues-style slide guitar playing as well on there. And David Bowie's awesome too. I love the flow to his vocals on the track. Just a really catchy, bouncy tune. And what I really love about the song as well is that after the chorus kicks in, we get this really kind of almost Allman Brothers uplifting guitar riff from Mick Ronson. It just has this southern bluesy kind of vibe to it, and Tony Visconti's bass is just absolutely pumping in the background. Really, really cool song. Later on in the track, David Bowie apparently does a Mark Bolan of T-Rex impression, where you hear those that dolphin-like effect to his voice, where he goes, "Bid you fondue." I can't do it, but I don't know. It has this weird kind of bizarre warble to his vocals. It's pretty funny, but yeah, just a great tune, really easy to get into, nothing like the rest of the album, and I'd give it a strong 8.5 out of 10. Now with track 4, After All, we get back into the Nightmare, guys, but it's a much more laid back and softer Nightmare than the track that came before it, All the Madmen. If I had to consider anything the ballad of the album, this would probably be it, but it's no less sinister than the other tracks, and even with the lyrics, has many references, or maybe a few references to Aleister Crowley and other occult themes that David Bowie was dealing with at the time. It's just a very, very haunting, melancholic song. Kind of has this waltz, slow-burning kind of vibe to it that really just sends shivers up and down your spine. David Bowie's vocals, just excellent on this song. Very, very soft and melodic, but haunting as well. And the thing that really stands out in this track are the backing vocals by the band. Every once in a while they come in with the line, "Oh, by Jingo," whatever the fuck that means. And it just sounds very disturbing and unsettling at the same time with the slow waltz-like atmosphere. And I kind of like Mick Ronson's, Italian-style guitar playing in the background, if you can call it that. There's no chugging riffs on this song, let's get that straight. But rather, Mick Ronson's in the background doing this little Italian acoustic thing on the guitar, which is kind of hard to describe, but you'll know what I mean when you listen to it. Really cool and unexpected on the song. It even gets into this middle section with this nightmare circus-like music. And whenever circus music comes into songs, that's just a cue that signals the song is going to get crazy, and it totally does. And during that section of the track, the flute is really taking center stage before the song gets back to the original melody. And then there is some guitar coming in later on in the song by Mick Ronson, where he's kind of reprising the "Oh, by Jingo" on his guitar, and it just wraps up in this haunting atmosphere. So yeah, excellent track After All. And I've read the Wikipedia page on this song, and a lot of people consider this a very underrated Bowie song, and I totally agree with them. Just love the vocal harmonies in the background as well. It's just a really cool song. I would easily give this an 8.5 out of 10, maybe even a 9 some days, but right now I'm feeling an 8.5. So, the next track on the album, a little track called Running Gun Blues, and this one here is basically David Bowie's Vietnam protest song, and it's a decent song, but you know what? Overall, this is one of my least favorite Bowie songs from the 70s. It just honestly doesn't really do much for me, and I hate to say it, but it's all because of David Bowie's vocals. It starts off with this acoustic intro, and then David Bowie comes in sounding absolutely weird, and there's this high-pitched kind of manic tone to his voice, and it's just really weird, and again, very unsettling. But then this heavy riff comes in, and it's an okay riff. It's not as amazing as the riff on uh, Width of a Circle and songs after that. It's just a pretty simplistic riff. Doesn't really do that for me. But then Bowie comes in with his vocals, and it's just too much. It's just overwhelming. It's just piercing and jarring, in my opinion. And the lyrics kind of turn me off as well. He talks about killing gooks and all this, obviously from the point of view of a warmongering Vietnam soldier or politician, but it's still unpleasant to listen to, in my opinion. But I don't know. That's just me. And again, the music's pretty good. Nothing wrong with it. Very bluesy. Got some slide guitar playing, but it's just a song that comes and goes, and the vocals kind of irritate me. So not one of my all-time favorites, but does have some redeeming quality. So I'm still gonna probably give it a 7 out of 10. Then the album kicks into another one of my favorites, Savior Machine. This song here is just absolutely crazy. Well, I guess that goes for almost all the tracks on this album. But this one here has a different vibe than a lot of the other ones. It has a jazzier vibe, a more kind of progressive rock vibe with all the mini Moog synthesizer solos and, little touches of color that adds. And it's a really cool song. And again, it opens up with this kind of jazzy intro that just builds an intensity with the there's even like a little few notes of sax, and I really think that's all the sax we even get on the album. But yeah, it's pretty frantic, and it's really driven by the synthesizer and the heavy guitar riffage in the background. Gives it a really heavy and frantic edge. David Bowie comes in, and again, on this song here, his voice is very creepy and unsettling, but in a good way. It fits the music, and it never feels like too much. And I love how he kind of gets into this section where his voice just drops in pitch, where he's almost crooning, really foreshadowing his mid to late 70s style vocals. But those vocals there, they just build and build in intensity until they get pretty high pitched and, again, just insane, which is awesome. So we get a little taste of what was to come with Bowie's vocals. There's some great Mick Ronson guitar solos. One at the 1 minute 30-second mark, and the other one that comes later on the track, kind of closing it off. And they're both really, just really good hard rock guitar solos. Really nothing else to say. There's a mini Moog little solo in the middle that's really triumphant as well. And the chorus is awesome as well. Don't let them stay. Don't let them stay. My body says. Again, it just reaches these crazy heights with all these effects on David Bowie's vocals, making him sound absolutely mad. And yeah, just overall very up-tempo, but not really a chugging heavy rock tune. More of a jazzy kind of progressive rock inspired song. So I really love Savior Machine. It's one of my favorites on the album, and I would easily give this a 9 out of 10. Coming up next, we have the absolutely crushing track, She Shook Me Cold. And this is Bowie at his heaviest, probably the sludgiest, doomiest, most Black Sabbath-inspired song on the album. And a very heavy one at that. So, yeah, going right back into the heavy territory with the doomy, sludgy, bluesy edge. And really a pretty cool song, actually. Not one of my absolute favorites on the album. I'd say probably next to Running Gun Blues. If I had to pick, this would be my second least favorite. But it's a pretty good track. And really, it's dominated by this guitar solo with Mick Ronson. But Tony Visconti's bass is really, really high in the mix. And it just gives you that pounding kind of backdrop. Or should I say foreground, because the bass is really in the forefront. It's mixed higher than the guitar at points. So really interesting performance there. It gets a little bit messy at points, and you feel like, maybe they should have dialed it back a bit there. So not an absolutely perfect instrumental solo section, but pretty good as well. And, David Bowie's voice is really deep on this section, really heavy, very, very heavy song. Has a wah-wah guitar opening. And it's pretty cool. So, not an essential Bowie song by any means, but if you're looking for something extremely heavy, if you're wondering what would happen if David Bowie recruited Tony Iommi as his guitar player, this would probably be the type of song they would have constructed. So yeah, She Shook Me Cold, really good song. I'd probably give it an 8 to an 8.5, somewhere in that range. So above average, but not an essential song. Finally, we arrive at the legendary title track of the album, The Man Who Sold the World. This is, for me, hands down, it's a no-brainer. This is one of my favorite Bowie songs. This is one of my favorite songs in general. Just everything about it is perfect. And, rather than being heavy and electric like the other track, this song here, other than Mick Ronson's iconic riff, is primarily acoustic, but it's no less haunting. I mean, this is probably the most haunting, ethereal track on the entire album. And, it's a shame that, more people don't know that this was actually written by Bowie, because I find that the original, his version is the best. And I'm not just saying that, because I do agree that sometimes covers can be better than the originals, but this is not the case with this track. The Man Who Sold the World is just one of his most legendary tracks. It's just perfect in every single way, perfectly produced. So many unique features on the song that, don't feature on any other Bowie track. First of all, let's just address the elephant in the room. Mick Ronson's iconic guitar solo. That hypnotic riff, nothing like his other riffs on the album. And it has this Middle Eastern vibe to it, and it just locks you in. It's just so hypnotic and beautiful. And then we get this awesome percussion in the background with this squeaky kind of sounding, I don't even know what instrument it is, but you musicians probably know, but I don't care. It just totally makes the song, giving it this kind of unsettling vibe. And the holy sounding church organ in the background. Those three components combined, you would never think it would work, but it totally does. And then Bowie's vocals. Oh my God, guys. It has this effect to it that just gives it this, again, I'm going to overuse the word haunting, but definitely gives it this haunting vibe. And, he never really goes off the edge into flamboyant territory like on some of the previous tracks. He always just stays within that kind of mid-range. And, again, the vocals are just so powerful on the song. The bass playing is just so melodic and totally elevates the whole thing with during the up-tempo section, the do, oh no, do, it's me. That part there, just really focus in on the bass. It's absolutely driving the entire track. And the organ as well, or the electric piano. And the ending of the song, oh my God, with those vocals, that harmonization, it's just sends shivers up and down your spine. Extremely special and an extremely creepy song at that. The Man Who Sold the World, arguably the best song on the album. It's definitely down to this or all the Madmen for me, closely followed by Width of a Circle, Save Your Machine, and the song after this. But they're all awesome. This song here, it's honestly perfect. I'm going to hesitate to give it a 10 out of 10 and stick with a 9.5, but some days I'm feeling a 10 out of 10. It's that great. Closing out the album, we get one of the most bombastic and strange songs on the entire thing, The Supermen. And, this song here, I don't know what it is about it. There's just something alluring to it. There's just something that draws you to it. And, although I criticize songs like Running Gun Blues for having these over-the-top, weird David Bowie vocals, it really works on songs like this. And honestly, there's just something about this song that just creeps me the fuck out. And I don't know, honestly, I think it's the backing vocals that have this wind-like effect that just kind of runs in the background. And it literally sounds like wind just blowing in your ears on a cold October night. Just a really weird track. I love how it opens with that bass and drum intro that kind of pounds throughout the entire track. But then we get a chugging riff in the background, bringing that heaviness back. And the funny thing is, apparently, Jimmy Page actually wrote this riff. Not that it's a Jimmy Page level riff. It's not as great as something like Whole Lotta Love or Black Dog or something like that. Then again, Black Dog was written by John Paul Jones. Anyway, I digress. But apparently in the mid-'60s, Jimmy Page did some sessions with David Bowie. He was a session musician at the time. And apparently this riff was kind of given to him at the time. So David Bowie kind of revived it and put it on the Supermen, so you can kind of hear it chugging in the background. But yeah, Bowie's vocal performance here is very strange and over the top, has this high pitch to it, and he really delivers a very unsettling and eccentric performance, to say the least. I mean, fuck, I wish I could see the guy singing this in the studio, because he sounds like an absolute madman on the album. And I really love the chorus where he says, far out on the red sky, and just that build to when it explodes and the song kind of just resets itself. Just a very, very creative song, to be honest. And then right when you thought you heard it all, it just unexpectedly changes into this bluesy guitar solo by Mick Ronson that kind of feels out of place, but it's enjoyable nonetheless. And it's a very, apocalyptic song inspired by the works of German writer Friedrich Nietzsche, or I don't know, I can't really pronounce it. But yeah, apparently it's a very apocalyptic inspired track. So the Supermen ending off the album on a very dark and haunting note, kind of like the rest of the album, I should say. But yeah, very interesting song. One of my favorites on it. I would give it easily an 8.5, sometimes a 9. Probably a 9, to be honest. Today I'm feeling a 9. But yeah, crazy track there. And that brings us to the end of the album. So that's The Man Who Sold the World, the third release by David Bowie, or the second true David Bowie album, if you don't want to count the debut. And, a controversial album. Again, I mentioned, really, Tony Visconti disputes that David Bowie wrote the majority of the album, and who really knows what was going on, but it's an excellent album, has so many highlights, but definitely not an easy listen. But when you're in the mood for it, nothing really satisfies like this album, especially in David Bowie's catalog. If you're in a dark mood and you want to hear something a little bit more on the weird, eccentric side, this is definitely the album to listen to. Or if you just like hard rock, one or the other. But you gotta like both to really appreciate the album. So, that's The Man Who Sold the World, guys. I'd be so happy to do some more David Bowie albums coming up. Again, I mentioned this isn't my absolute favorite Bowie album, so I got lots of material to work with. So stay tuned in the future for more David Bowie, one of the greatest solo artists of all time. So take care, guys. Peace, and rock on.